Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Today we're going to go back to talking about places again, and today we're going to talk about the Gambia and Senegal. And that's why that says that on the lead slide. Senegal essentially surrounds Gambia, and the Gambia is the smallest country on mainland Africa. The Gambia River is a major river. Actually, the country is basically the shoreline of that river. It runs about 1,130 kilometers or some 700 miles. It's navigable for about half of its length. Banjul, where we're going to be, is the capital of the country, and it remains one of Africa's smallest cities, even though it's a capital. Today, the port city itself, the core center, is about 31,000 people, and I guess if you count the whole metropolitan area, such as it is, it's about 40,000. Anyway, Banjul is nestled on St. Mary's Island, and it's at the mouth of the Gambia River. The island is connected to the mainland, and the rest of the greater Banjul area, there's a bunch of bridges and ferries that go across so people can transit it. Land area for the city is about 12 square kilometers, or just under 5 square miles. Now, until 1973, Banjul was known as Bathurst. This area has a significant variety of African and European birds. The two of note that I'll talk about, are, well, at least at this part, when we're talking about the Gambia, are the African jacana and the Goliath heron. Now, the jacana also is called a lily trotter because it seems to be able to just walk on water. Sometimes some people refer to it as the Jesus bird. They're really identified because they have really huge feet and claws. Their feet are bigger than a human hand, and that enables them just to walk on floating vegetation in shallow lakes and rivers. Now, Goliath is the largest known heron in the world. Stands about 152 centimeters, or some 5 feet tall. The bird has a 230 centimeter or 7.5 foot wingspan, so it's a pretty big bird. Its call is a distinct deep bark, and it's often described, forgive me for doing these calls again, but you kind of have to be able to hear this. It's kind of a coo-work. Isn't that great? Coo-work. Everybody follow? Coo-work. So when you're out in the jungle and you see one of these things, you could talk to it. Anyway, that call is audible for distances up to 2 kilometers, so it carries pretty well through the foliage here. When this bird is disturbed, it makes a much sharper and a higher call. It sounds like ark. Sounds like my parrot friend from the Caribbean. Anyway, when the prey appears, this Goliath actually will turn down, he'll open his beak a little bit, and he'll spear the prey underwater. Susie and I, we didn't have one like this. We had a big gray heron, and we had a sushi pond in our backyard. Actually, it was koi, but the heron thought it was sushi. He cleaned us out in about 2 days. Very little is known about Gambia's ancient past, but within the Senegal-Gambia region, there are several hundred of these megalithic sites. There are about 30,000 carved stones that are arranged in pretty neat circles. The ancient stone circles resemble pretty much miniature Stonehenges. The Serer people are thought to have made the Senegambian stone circles. They run from Senegal all the way through the Gambia, and they're described by UNESCO as, quote, the largest concentration of stone circles seen anywhere in the world. Around the megalithic circles, they found pottery shards, human remains, and even some grave goods. Archaeological evidence at the sites such as the Tawasu indicates that the stone circles may be as old as 1,500 years, and each circle could be anywhere from 10 to 24 stones, just depending on how big the circle itself was. They range in size from about 7 meters, or about 25 feet, and up. One common feature that many of the circles have is that out from the circle there will often be a line of pillars that's set away. It's generally always on the east side, and at some sites there are larger groups of circles, not just a single circle, but a large group of them all in one place. The history of the first human settlements in West Africa began about 10,000 years ago. 4,000 years later, farming began, and that was followed by the forging of iron for tools as well as for weapons. Contact was established with the Mediterranean civilizations, and regular trade was established. There are several different ethnic groups that live in the Gambia. Each has its own language, its own history, culture, and traditions. The Fula women, like the men, have these markings on their faces, around their eyes, and their mouths. They were all given to them when they were little children using indigo ink tattoos. The Fula make up about 18% of the Gambia's total population, and they are the second largest ethnic group in the country. They are also the largest nomadic ethnic group in the world. They inhabit several territories over an area larger than the continental United States. The Fulani follow a pretty specific and discrete code of behavior. They practice, among other things, patience, discipline, modesty, and respect for others, including their foes. They'd never make it in politics in the West. The Mandinka is the largest ethnic group in the country with an estimated global population of some 11 million. Now, they don't live in the Gambia, that's just their total population, but they represent 42% of Gambia's population. They're the descendants of the Mali Empire, which rose to power under the rule of the Mandinka king. And that was back during the 16th century. Then in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, many Mandinka were enslaved and shipped to the Americas. A significant portion, a very large portion of the African Americans in the United States, as well as the African descendants that live in the Caribbean, are descended from these Mandinka people. Today, many of them still practice a rite of passage known as a kankarang. At the age between 4 and 14, both male and female children have their genitalia ritually cut. The rite marks the beginning of adulthood. Surrounded by the former initiates, the kankarang, or witch doctor, struts around, and he is menacingly swinging 2 machetes. He also emits a very high-pitched cry or a scream, and that's to teach the children the rules of behavior, the importance of tradition, cultural identity, and a sense of community. These age-old traditional masquerade ceremonies remain very widely practiced throughout the Gambia. At the Gambia National Museum in Banjul, there is a large kankarang mask that guards the entrance door. So if you go there, you'll see this big mask right inside the door. Women, children, and the uncircumcised must hide themselves from this spirit. So there's a little caution for you. The Gambia's constitution ensures that its people have the right to practice any religion that they choose. Now, this is a Muslim country. It was declared Muslim recently by their leader, their president, if you will. But over 99% of the Mandinka in Africa are Muslim, but Christians make up about 8% of the population of the Gambia. Virtually all the business here comes to an absolute standstill during major Muslim holidays. And of course, we're there on Friday, which is a traditional day of worship. By the 12th century, local leaders had all converted to Islam. Muslim merchants established communities in several West African commercial centers. They established trans-Sahara trade routes, and that led to traffic in such wonderful things as slaves, gold, ivory, as well as in the importation of manufactured goods. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to arrive in the area during their search for a sea route to Asia. While that was in the mid-15th century, they soon dominated the area's overseas trade. In 1588, the Portuguese sold exclusive trading rights on the Gambia River to English merchants and traders. Those traders sent slaves to Europe to work as servants. In the early 1800s, the United Kingdom abolished the slave trade throughout its empire. Britain tried, pretty much unsuccessfully, to end the slave trade in the Gambia. Slave ships were intercepted by the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron, and they were returned to the Gambia. The people that came back or were brought back were released on an island far up the Gambia River, and there they were expected to establish new lives. not to go back to the villages that they had come from. Now, an interesting thing here, you see all these beautiful ships with their sails. If it was a day like today, they weren't going to chase very many people. For those of you who have looked out, it's pretty calm today. It's pretty nice out there. Anyway, James Island here in the Gambia is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's now known as the Kunta Kinte Island. The island is steeped in slave trade history, and the first European settlers on the island came from a vassal state of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Most people don't even think that the Polish-Lithuanian people came down this far, but they were there. James Island was initially used for gold and ivory trade, and ultimately went to the trade in humans. In 1651, the local fort was briefly held by the Dutch, and that was until the English captured it just 10 years later. They renamed the island in name and the fort itself after King James II of England. That fort was destroyed and it was rebuilt several times. And of course, that's when the English and the French and pirates were all squabbling over this territory. They wanted the river, they wanted the access to the interior, and so on. 6-gun battery and Fort Bullen were built with the specific intent of thwarting the slave trade after it had become illegal in the British Empire. In 2011, James Island was renamed by the local government to Kunta Kinte Island to give it a Gambian name. Now, Kunta Kinte is a character that was described in Alex Haley's book and the TV series Roots. Kinte was one of 98 slaves that in 1767 were taken to Maryland in North America. There is some question as to the validity of that particular story, but it was based on information that Haley got when he was here in the Gambia. As many as 3 million slaves may have been taken over the 3 centuries that the transatlantic slave trade operated. There's really no way to determine how many were actually taken during the because of the intertribal warfare that was going on before that trade started. A lot of slaves were taken and used just by the natives here in the parts of West Africa. Haley's novel, while telling a compelling family story, effectively informed the world regarding the true horrors of slavery. After his visit, a small local museum was built, and it was intended to educate and inform visitors. That's pretty sad, though, because the little museum is pretty poorly funded and it has really relatively limited facilities and resources. Today, Kunta Kinte Island is also suffering from very severe erosion. It's only 1/6 the size that it was at the time when the fort itself was active. Into the 18th century, the British and the French empires continually struggled for political and commercial supremacy in the region. The British Empire occupied the Gambia when an expedition landed there following the capture of Senegal in 1758. The first Treaty of Versailles gave Great Britain possession of the Gambia River. Well, the French retained a little teeny enclave on the river's north bank. So in history, there was this kind of a territory that went all along the river, and then there was this little bump that said that's French. But that was finally ceded to the United Kingdom in 1856. So it basically all became British for the whole length. Now, it's not that wide because you can, when you see the maps of it, the country itself is just follows the riverbed. From the results of a bloodless coup in 1994, a 29-year-old lieutenant named Gemma had become the head of state. He is still, by the way, Gambia's president. He's pretty much an authoritarian, almost a dictator, but he has been pretty much responsible for the stability of the country. Now, this Arch 22 monument it commemorates that coup. It stands across the main highway that goes in and out of Banjul. Almost anything that you do, if you're not staying right in the city proper, you're going to go through that arch. It sits in this, next to this big roundabout, and in the roundabout is this large bronze statue of an unknown soldier holding a young child and holding up the sign of peace. In 2013, the Gambian Interior Minister announced that the country was leaving the Commonwealth of Nations. So they are no longer part of that Commonwealth, And that ended a 48-year relationship. What do you want to do if you go to Banjul? Well, there's a lot of things. Actually, it's kind of a neat country. We were there about a month ago when we came south on the marina. If it's shopping you want, you can find anything at the market, right? Literally anything. But the locals there do not like to have their photographs taken. If you point your camera or your iPhone at them, a lot of times you'll see them put their hands up. They don't like their photos taken. That's most evident among the women. Most of the selling is done just on the pavement or in small shops that are located in the former colonial trade buildings. A Gambian woman once claimed that she was able to bear a child after visiting the 500-year-old crocodile pond. Barren women are washed in the sacred water from this pond by specially trained women of the Bojang clan. They're also given a bottle of this water that's taken from the pool so they can continue washing with the water to ensure the fertility. In return for a small donation, which is usually requested, and that could be something like a piece of cloth and a koala nut, or a cola nut, you get this bottle of water and you get whatever they're going to do. Anyway, half of the nut is given to the elderly, and the other half is thrown into the pond to appease the crocodiles. Well, one of the things the cola nut has in it is a very bitter flavor, but it's also very high in caffeine. Now, there are over 80 crocodiles in and around this pool, and the crocs are so tame that you can even go up and pet their backs. Every morning, scores of tourists come here to have their photos taken while they pet the reptiles. And of course, Susie had to do that. Now really, folks, do you really want to pet a crocodile that's buzzed on caffeine? I don't know about that. Now we also, when we were here last time, we had an opportunity to visit schools and families and so on. And the school we visited in Banjul was very clean, and the students all stood when we entered their classroom. It was remarkable. They sang a song to thank us for our visit and for the gifts that we had taken them. Their blackboards and the charts that were up on the wall in the room indicated that they were studying health education. And that's a very much needed subject given the onslaught of AIDS and Ebola and things like that in West Africa. Now, one of the other things that we noticed as we were going through the marketplace is they were just giving out condoms. So it's a little different, you know. And I don't know if they thought they were shopping bags or what, but they were giving them out. We drove through the countryside on some muddy, pretty bumpy roads. I mean, to call them roads is kind of an exaggeration. We finally ended up in a family compound where this very large extended family lived. It was a compound that might have been, maybe 100 meters on a side, and there were like 8 or 10 houses inside of this compound around a central courtyard. We met Auntie. She was the oldest woman in the compound. We went into their houses. We had a very nice visit there. And then we were seated outside a long table where we had lunch. It was a communal rice dish with peanut sauce and some small pieces of potato and meat in it. These were Muslim people, but they all went to Christian schools. Very interesting country because they don't have any of the angst that we see in other places in the world between Muslims and non-Muslims. They cared about the world, peace, education, and they were very curious about us and our lives. There was just something about the whole friendliness of this family, the extended family, that was just remarkable. We really enjoyed our day there. Our atmosphere was, this is kind of cool. We're sitting at this table in this courtyard surrounded by houses, and what's hanging right next to us? Their laundry. It was like we were just part of the family. Come on in, have lunch with us, and we're going to just do this. Anyway, the laundry was hanging out there to dry, and there were just scads of children. They were brothers, sisters, cousins, all running around. There probably were about 40 children, and they ranged in age from 2 to 10. And then there were some older young adults that were there. The oldest woman was Auntie, as I said. The oldest man was the head man for the village, and he lived in this compound. And the other thing that was kind of unique is they had that huge television or satellite dish was right in the center of this very small, chaotic courtyard. Well, it was interesting. Sometimes if you want to talk about our experience there, it was wonderful. We had a great time with this family, and we'd love to talk about it. Anyway, the vans that we had, and this is not untypical for the Gambia, had no air conditioning. And the axles were probably welded right to the frame because it was pretty bumpy. Now, we really got a chance to enjoy the bumps of the road and also the heat because one of the vans, the windows wouldn't open. So you were kind of in a moving sauna. Anyway, on the way back and on the way out as well, we had to go through several police checkpoints. So when you're going out in the Gambia, you'll see these police checkpoints. Our van was never stopped. Usually it was just waved through. And the guide told us that primarily what they're looking for is they're checking driver's licenses, insurance, and they're looking for vans or vehicles that are overloaded. They're going to sail now off to Senegal. Now, Senegal is located about 14 degrees or 840 miles north of the equator. The northern coast here has sand dunes, and the southern areas are pretty much muddy estuaries and kind of swampy. French is the official language, but there are many other native languages that are spoken and recognized. The country is named after the Senegal River, but there are several other theories, one of which I personally prefer, about where the name came from. The most popular one, I think, that it stems from the phrase which means our canoe, when you translate it from the native tongue. And it really is used to kind of bring up kind of a national solidarity, if you will, in the Senegal. And basically it means something like, well, we're all in the same canoe or we're all in the same boat, so we might just as well get together. And you'll see it a lot in the media, particularly if you read their local newspapers. The silk cotton tree forms the center of many of the Senegalese villages, and a tree has a lot of exposed roots at its base. It's sometimes called the elephant tree because it's so gigantic, but to locals it's more commonly known as the fromager, which is a French word for cheese, and that's because it has a very soft, light wood. The silk cotton tree can grow to a height of about 150 feet or more, and that means it towers over pretty much the rest of the rainforest. It's considered sacred, and many believe that the souls of a departed loved one live either in its root or up in one of the branches. Another valuable tree to the Senegalese is the kapok tree. You'll see these also all over this part of West Africa. In many areas, these big slabs of straight trunk are used to make dugout canoes. Now, these trees have a fluffy seed covering. It's kind of like, I don't know what, like cotton almost. And they use it for pillows and mattresses. But because it's very buoyant and water resistant, in the past it was often used for flotation devices and for boat cushions as well as for life jackets. The tree's seeds, its pods, its bark, and the resin for the tree are used to treat such things in the native pharmacy, if you will. They treat dysentery, fever, asthma, and kidney disease. So if you have any of those, just go chew on a kapok tree. The Senegal River Delta is a wetland of, maybe 32,000 acres. Now, the area has over 1 million resident birds, and it has an estimated additional 3 million birds that pass through there when they're on the migrations. So it's a pretty birdy area. Anyway, residents there include the great white pelican and the purple heron. Now, this guy, the great white pelican, is truly a huge bird. Has a wingspan that can range up to 360 centimeters. For those of us that need to know this, I wrote this down. That's about 12 feet. That's a big bird. Anyway, they're quite cumbersome on land, and they look kind of goofy in the water, but they're very magnificent and graceful flyers. They can fly continuously for a whole day and into the night, actually 24 hours or more, and they can cover 300 miles in a single flight without stopping. Their groups often travel in very large, spectacular V formations. So when we're along in Senegal, particularly along the coast and stuff, kind of keep an eye out for them. They're pretty spectacular. Now, the waters of the Senegal River Delta are also home to several species of crocodile. I know you've already gotten acquainted with those. You've pet them and made friends of them. They probably don't make good house pets, but nonetheless, they're there. And they also have warthogs. Of note, though, is the endangered West African manatee. This is a nocturnal animal, so you may not see too many of them because during the daytime, it'll go into shallow water where it just snoozes. Now, the manatee has become a very vulnerable species because of its meat and skin, and that can bring a lot of money to poachers. The oil of the African manatee is said to cure ailments such as ear infections and rheumatism. The animal's bones are used to make walking stick handles, as well as to make spinning tops used in a local game. The West African manatee is basically very much like the ones in North America. They're a plant-eating marine mammal, and they're related to the dugong. Now, the African manatees grow up to maybe 5.5 meters or 14 feet long, and they can weigh about 800 pounds. Obviously, they spend a lot of time at the buffet. They are extremely slow-moving, and they only move maybe 3 to 5 miles an hour. They're not the fastest thing that you're going to see unless they're running or fleeing. They don't run, but swimming to get away from a predator. And then they can travel at speeds of about 32 kilometers or 20 miles an hour. Now, I can move that fast when I'm trying to stay away from a predator or when my wife is mad. Between the 9th and the 11th centuries, the kingdom of Ghana was located within the present-day borders of Mauritania, Mali, and Senegal. The empire's founding was explained in an epic where the king offered his son a griot to advise him during his reign. Now, griot is just a historian, a storyteller, a bard, a poet, as well as a musician. And the griots are often seen as societal leaders, and that's due to their traditional positions as advisors to the royalty. The griot profession is passed down from generation to generation. You can't just go in and get a griot license at the local store. You have to inherit the position, and it requires many years of training and apprenticeship in genealogy, history, and music. Griots tell the story that these countries were so rich, and I mentioned this the other day, that the dogs wore gold collars. The horses were adorned with silken rope halters, and they slept on plush Persian carpets. They've lived a pretty high life because I don't even sleep on a Persian carpet. Being a griot is no means limited to males. There are many women whose talents as singers and musicians are equally remarkable. Griots form an endogenous caste, which means that most of them marry only fellow griots. They don't marry outside of that society. Most villages have their own individual griot who tells tales about births and deaths and marriages, battles, hunts, affairs, and hundreds of other things. Although they're popularly known as praise singers, griots may use their vocal expertise for gossip, satire, or political comment. So if you want to have a discussion with a griot, be real careful what you share. His or her wit can be devastating to local people, and their knowledge of local history is often intimidating. The Lebu people emerged around 1430, somewhere in northern Dakar. They're primarily a fishing community, but they have a pretty substantial business today in both construction supplies and that sort of stuff. The Lebu society emphasizes piety and respect for elders. Lebu families include not only living people, but their families are also considered to include all of their associated ancestral spirits. Of Senegal's population, 94% define themselves as Muslim, 5% as Christian, and the remainder, 1%, as followers of traditional animist practices. The Lebu are noted for their animist public exorcism dances and rituals, and they're often attended by tourists. So you may have an opportunity to go see one of these interesting rituals. Interestingly, a majority of the people who participate in those practices also consider themselves to be proper followers of Islam, and in some cases even Christianity. The thing that's interesting about those that also profess Islam is Islam forbids many of the practices that the people choose to take part in, but they don't do anything to stop it. When a person is possessed, I often get accused of being possessed, an exorcism or indep ceremony is held. Now, the goal is to remove the evil spirit as well as to introduce the possessed person back into the community. The exorcisms usually last about 3 to 4 days, sometimes as many as 8 days of chanting and dancing, and I think there might be beverages to try while they're doing that. This is in order to identify the ridlum, the specific ridlum that will set the spirit in motion and leave the body of the possessed. So you got to get the right thing, and then the bad spirit will leave. At every endep, an animal is designated to serve as the vessel of the evil spirit. That is probably not the best for the health of that animal. Endep ceremonies are not the only way to remove ill-intentioned spirits. Both in rural and urban settings, they use powders when they're showering to wash themselves of the spirits. They get these powders from their local griot and their local witch doctors, and they literally cover themselves with these powders to get rid of the evil spirits. Into the Senegalese zeitgeist come the Europeans. Now, European traders became a force in the Senegal region back in the 15th century. The Portuguese reached the Bay of Dakar, initially as slave raiders, but they were repulsed by the natives. Regardless, that transatlantic African slave trade resumed, with the Portuguese taking hundreds of captives back to their own country. In 1588, the United Netherlands captured Goree Island, and that's about a 3-mile or 3-kilometer or about 1.5 miles off the coast of Dakar. The island switched hands between the Portuguese and the Dutch several times, and it fell to the English and then to the French in 1677. Under continuous French administration since, many descended today from the Dutch and French traders and their African wives. In 1725, a cattle herding tribe launched the first major reformist protest in the region. They overthrew the local animist, and they attempted to democratize the society. At the same time, the Europeans started to travel into the interior of Africa to do trading and explore. Dakar grew up around a French fort that was built back in 1857. The French also annexed the Lebu Republic. In its scramble for West Africa in the 1880s, the Europeans started to colonize the inland areas. Previously, they had mostly controlled just trading ports along the coast and rivers. All of this culminated in a French rule of the area. By 1895, Senegal became part of what was known as French West Africa, but there was still a considerable amount of local resistance. The Battle of Dakar was also known as Operation Menace, and it was an attempt in the early part of World War II by the Allies to capture Dakar. The British Navy wanted to rally the colonial administration. They were hoping to detach it from the pro-German Vichy French. The success of the operation could be replaced, if it was successful, it would replace the Free French under Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle believed that he could persuade the Vichy French forces in Dakar to join the Allied cause, and that much could be gained from this. Another Vichy French colony changing sides would have really great political impact. The port of Dakar was far superior as a naval base than the ones that were in Sierra Leone, which was the only Allied port in the area. And that didn't hurt that there were also gold reserves of the Bank of France, as well as for the Polish government, that were being held in safekeeping in Dakar. So the Allies decided to launch a task force to free the city. Their orders were to negotiate with the French governor for a peaceful occupation. Well, that didn't work out, and they were to then take the city by force. Overall, the Battle of Dakar did not go well for the Allies. The Vichy forces didn't back down. even though most of the Vichy sites were never hit because the Allies missed their targets. The effect of the Allied failure was generally political. De Gaulle wasn't able to persuade the Vichy French to change sides, and as a result, it damaged his reputation among the Allies. Now, even his success at another battle 2 months later, that didn't repair the damage. And finally, control of the area was given over by Churchill to de Gaulle. I don't know if Churchill felt sorry for him or just decided he didn't want to have anything to do with the French colony. But not before late 1942, and after the United States forces joined the war, that's when they defeated Germany and the French Vichy. The U.S. occupied Dakar and stayed until the end of the war, but there were still a lot of problems. In 1944, West African recruits from the French army mutinied against the poor conditions that they confronted with. That was mainly at a camp located on the outskirts of Dakar. The mutiny was seen as an indictment of the French colonial system. It created a crisis for the national movement. A little background here, okay? The colonial infantry were not paid the same pensions as their fellow French soldiers during or even after World War II. The African soldiers also claimed that benefits were owed to the former people who had been prisoners of war. The discrimination led to a mutiny by about 1,300 Senegalese soldiers. They had been repatriated to this camp awaiting discharge. A French general promised to have the rate changed to a par with that applicable to white veterans. French soldiers guarding the camp opened fire, killing between 35 and 70 African soldiers. The French provisional government of Charles de Gaulle then acted quickly to ensure that the claims were settled. Following World War II, a campaign for independence sprung up all across West Africa, and after a decade of protest, riots, and clashes, French West Africa voted for autonomy in 1958. It divided into the countries of today, while most of the British colonies gained autonomy 10 years later. Senegal peacefully attained independence from France in 1960. Within the next few years, more chaos in Senegal, and Senegal and Spain agreed to jointly patrol the Senegalese coast to curb the exodus of illegal migrants heading for Europe. By 2007, Spanish authorities launched a campaign on Senegalese television to discourage illegal migration. That same year, the president of Senegal declared 3 days of mourning. It was after the leader of the country's richest and most powerful Islamic Brotherhood died. Opposition parties won control of several cities in the local elections, including Dakar. The International Court of Justice in The Hague tried to force Senegal to bring their former president to trial, and that was for alleged human rights abuses during his time in power. The Prime Minister of Senegal stepped down after his governing coalition suffered big losses in the election. But the president's son, this is the president that was being charged by the International Court, was included in the new cabinet, and that led to some more clashes between the troops and the rebels. So what is there to do in Dakar? Well, if you don't want to attend an exorcism, let's go kind of look around the area. Dakar is about 500 kilometers or 300 miles from Cape Verde Islands. The poet, philosopher, and first president of Senegal tried to transform Dakar into a sub-Saharan African Athens. As such, it's very ethnically diverse, but it's hardly like Athens. Dakar has a large Lebanese community that dates back to the 1920s and a community of Moroccan business people. The city is home to as many as 20,000 French expatriates, and France still maintains an Air Force base here, and the French fleet is still serviced in Dakar's harbor. The Grand Mosque of Dakar was designed by French and Moroccan architects. It was opened in 1964 by the King of Morocco and the Senegalese president. It's beautiful on the inside. It's a lovely building, and the outside has this minaret that rises some 67 meters or about 200 feet above the ground. The Grand Mosque is one of the most important religious buildings in the city, but Senegal is a pretty moderate country, and it's long had a place where Muslims, Christians, and so on coexist very peacefully. One statesman proclaimed, quote, "We are born into the Senegalese tradition of cohabitation between Muslims and Christians. What is essential is the respect between people," unquote. One of the more interesting monuments in Dakar is the Porte du Troisième Millénaire. Now, it symbolizes the African continent at the crossroads of the millennia, back in the year 2000. The monument is 16.5 meters high, or 54 feet. There are 3 doors, or openings, if you will, and each has a message, and all of these are surrounded with sculptures of baobab trees and so on. The smallest opening actually symbolizes the acquisition of knowledge. The second door, the middle one, invokes the progressively more complex evolution of thought and culture. It's also the entry into industrialization. There's a statue of a woman with a flute that's seated by the second door. She's nicknamed Mama Dearest, and the flute represents a call to gather or as an invitation to change. The third door is the largest, and its edges are flared. They kind of flare out a little bit to frame the woman with the flute. This high arch symbolizes the era of communication and global village forming. It was open to the world. It also sends a message of hope for Africa. Now, again, remember, this is a Muslim country, so the statue isn't liked by all. Muslims were outraged at the monument, saying it was an aggression against their religion, and some have renamed the place the Gate of Misfortune, because remember, within the Muslim community, they don't like pictures or portrayals of humans. Another controversial statue, and this is really hard to miss, I'll tell you, it's really hard to miss. It's a newly completed African Renaissance monument. It's the tallest statue in Africa at about 160 feet high. From its base to the top, it's taller than the Statue of Liberty. It was built in 2010 and was dedicated to Africa's emergence from the European regimes at the end and the end of slavery. It also is meant as a display of African pride to shirk foreign perceptions of Africans as lesser people. One local complained it was anything but a symbol of African Renaissance and had nothing to do with art. The deputy leader of the government's opposition party described the monument as, quote, "an economic monster and a financial scandal in the context of the country's current economic crisis," unquote. That statue cost about $27 million US, but it didn't cost the government anything. Payment was made in kind because some 40 hectares or I guess 80 acres of land was donated in the cause by a Senegalese businessman. Last month we took the shuttle into Dakar from the ship, and it was kind of scary and smelly. I mean, this is like a lot of other places you all have now had the experience to go to. At the market, it was particularly true. In spite of the fact that all around there were high rises and 4-lane streets and things like that. Traffic was horrendous. To say the least, it was horrendous in the Senegal. And what should have been about a 10-minute ride into the town worked out to be, about 40 minutes. So the shuttles may not hit the right schedule for you. Anyway, and that takes you into Independence Square. A French-speaking country was all but friendly. They weren't the most happy, friendly people like we've seen in other places. The handicraft area near the ship had all kinds of stuff out on the pier that you could buy, but the sellers were pretty pushy. So you kind of have to take that into advisement when you go out. The best thing for the buck, I think, is Lake Retba. Now, it's also known as Lac Rose or the Pink Lake. It's currently under consideration by UNESCO to become a World Heritage Site. Pink Lake is located about 30 kilometers, some 18 miles northeast of Dakar. And the lake's salt is exported all across the region And it's actually collected by some 3,000 men, who mostly men, there are some women, but they go out into this lake. They come from all over Africa. They work 6 to 7 hours a day standing in this lake, pulling salt out. They catch the salt and they put it into barges. They protect their skin with shea butter. I don't think they buy it from the body shop, but anyway, they use shea butter, and that's an emollient that's produced from shea nuts. And according to them, it helps avoid tissue damage. And when you see what these people have to work in, it's really surprising that they are willing to do that. Wow, why is the lake pink? Well, it has a very high salt content, and the water provides a perfect, absolute perfect living condition for a thing called halobacteria. You remember that, bacteria, right? Everybody knows halobacteria. You have some, you keep it around as a whatever in your home. Anyway, and that's color is pink, and that's also what gives the flamingos their pink color when we were down in Namibia. And the fish in the lake here have adapted to its very high salt content by evolving ways to pump out extra salt. They actually can pull the salt out of the water and push it out of their system, so their system stays pretty neutral. But they're pretty small. They're about 4 times smaller, about 25% of a normal fish of the same species that would be living in a normal environment. Now, what's called saltwater, that particular shrinking is called saltwater dwarfism. I don't know why all of a sudden the titles got pulled off of this, but this is a young man drying those miniature fish. Anyway, I never knew about saltwater fish dwarfism. Well, stick with me, in other talks I'm going to give you other stuff that I never knew about either. Anyway, we can meet out in Baristas after I'm done here, have a cup of coffee and chat about this, chat about the Gambia and Senegal and so on. Anytime you meet me or Susie around the ship, please feel free to come up and chat with us. We like to do that, and I'd like to thank you very much for the time we've had this afternoon. Thank you.